End of a long day, I'm a teacher, it's time for a pop quiz. Can anyone tell me what the Chinese Exclusion Act did? No, that's pretty easy, of course. It excluded Chinese people. They weren't being very subtle about it. They were very upfront. We're going to pass a law called the Chinese Exclusion Act that excludes Chinese people. So the Chinese Exclusion Act was an act in the 19th century that deliberately said we do not want certain people from a certain part of the world. Isn't it wonderful that in the 21st century we would never do anything like that at all, not in the 21st century? What happened, though, in 1965 is that the immigration laws in our country changed. What didn't happen was in 1965 was that they just threw open the doors and said anybody who wants to come into the United States can come in. What actually happened was that there was a particular size of immigration, and they changed the distribution within that pie in 1965. They got rid of some of the racist laws that says we're not going to take immigrants from this part of the world or immigrants from this part of the world, and said we'll take immigrants not just from Europe, but also from Africa, from Latin America, and from Asia. So we have a redistribution and a changing of the shape of the pie and the distribution within that pie. What we didn't have was just throwing open the doors to let anybody and everybody come in because there was a controlled immigration. Now, since 1965, because it went from 1965 to 50 plus years later, we had a slow and gradual and incremental diversity that began to appear because we were accepting more and more non-white immigrants to the United States. So over a 50-plus year period of time, we get greater diversity until, of course, in 2008, we passed a very significant milestone, meaning that a third of the U.S. population right now are ethnic minorities or of non-European, non-white descent. In the last 20 years, that diversity that we have seen began to accelerate. And people began to get a little nervous about that diversity. And they began to ask questions about what are we going to do because there is so much diversity. And one of those answers, of course, is let's build a wall. My thought is the wall's not enough. Let's build a dome. Let's seal this thing off. Let's hermetically seal off the United States of America and make sure nobody gets in or out of our country. But even if you were to seal off the United States of America with a dome, you would still have diversity. Because diversity in America right now is not tied to immigration patterns, it's tied to birth rates. It's tied to birth rates. In 2011, we passed a very important threshold. Half of all the children, all the babies born in the United States, were of non-European descent. They were ethnic minorities. 5 years later, which makes perfect sense, the incoming kindergarten class in the United States were half ethnic minorities. By 2023, half of all the children in the United States are going to be of non-European, non-white descent. And by 2042, half of all Americans are going to be of non-European, non-white descent. This means, again, that the diversity in America is not due to immigration, it's due to birth rates. In fact, from 2009 to 2014, the net immigration from Mexico was actually negative 140,000. We lost immigrants to Mexico rather than gaining immigrants from Mexico. Diversity is because of birth rates, not because of immigration. Now, this has been very interesting to plot this, not just in our larger American society, but one of the ways that this diversity has really shown itself is actually in American religion, in religious affiliation. Surprisingly, actually, in the Christian church. So that in the Christian church, we're actually seeing more and more diversity, and this diversity in the Christian church has actually strengthened the church. It has actually strengthened the number of people who go to church because of this diversity. What we have seen, according to Stephen Warner at the University of Illinois, Chicago, is that the new immigrants represent not the de-Christianization of American society, but the de-Europeanization of American Christianity. You see a very important but subtle difference there of the de-Christianization of American society versus the de-Europeanization of American Christianity. But as we have diversified in our society and even in the churches, we have responded to this diversity oftentimes with actually separation and segregation. And we found that actually in the church, we are actually seeing greater segregation and separation, even though on a macro level there is greater diversity, on a micro level there is greater segregation and separation. This can be attributed to a sociological concept called homophily. Simply put, it speaks about the Greek proverb that says, birds of a feather flock together. What happens is that many of us, when we hang out with our friends, or we go to a bar, or we go to a concert, or we go to a birthday party, it is likely that the people we hang out with are going to be similar to the type of person that we are. Meaning it's probably roughly the same age bracket. It's probably the similar socioeconomic income level. It's probably similar levels of education, and even similar or same ethnic, cultural, racial background. So birds of a feather tend to flock together. We tend to segregate along racial lines and cultural lines in terms of our social networks. This is particularly true, it turns out, in an institution like religion or churches that self-segregate or self-select. So when you are self-selecting your religious identification, you are more likely to buy into the principles of homophily and go to churches or communities where similar people are already there. Birds of a feather flock together. What this has done is actually it has led to an extreme level of segregation in our churches, an extreme level of segregation in the institutions that tend to self-select. This is very evident in your local neighborhood. So go to your local neighborhood. Visit your local elementary school. Walk into that building and you will find actually extraordinary diversity. You'll find kids from all different nationalities and languages and cultures in your local elementary school because it reflects the diversity in your neighborhood. Now go across the street and go to the church that's right across the street from that local school, and you will not see the type of diversity you just saw at the local school. One study shows that it is more likely for public schools to be integrated 6 times more integrated than the local church. So because churches self-select and schools tend not to self-select, you have diversity in the school, but you lack diversity within your local church or local congregation. And what that has led to is extreme levels of segregation. And even though we might share our same religion, we might share even the same denomination, even our same belief system, many people in the church do not share the same space because they're in segregated churches. This leads to something, a unique kind of phenomenon within churches and congregations. What happens is that when you have a self-segregated selected system, you close off this system and you have operating within that system certain values, certain ways of doing things, practices that you end up perpetuating within that system. So when you have a closed system, you tend to repeat, recycle, and do what other people do within that system, follow patterns of behavior. This is called isomorphism. And isomorphism is very common in church context or in religious context. Here's an example. There is a Buddhist monastery, and the monks of that monastery, these Buddhist monks, have taken a lifelong vow of poverty. And the congregation, the Buddhist monastery, has given each of these monks who have taken a lifelong vow of poverty 401k retirement plans. So here we have individuals who have taken a lifetime vow of poverty with really healthy retirement plans. Why? Isomorphism. Because when you have a closed system, you repeat and recycle the patterns of behavior in that closed system. And when in a closed system of social work, of religion, you have retirement plans for your clergy and for the people that serve you. And so these monks who have a lifelong vow of poverty have healthy 401ks. So what we're dealing with then is a system that is closed, and we recirculate and we recycle values and ideas within that system. Now, once you close that system, you have certain rules that govern that system. One of those rules is another sociological concept called social capital. Social capital simply is the way that we relate to one another and build relationships and community within that closed system. Here's the best example that I can think of. I actually spent 17 years in New England. I was in the Boston and Cambridge, Massachusetts area. So I am a hardy New Englander. And we get snow in New England. But we know how to handle the snow because we have snow shovels that shovel the snow. We will take care of that snow. So when I moved out here to the Midwest about 10 years ago, imagine my surprise when I realized that the rest of the country is not hardy like New Englanders. In fact, Midwesterners use this wimpy machine called snow blowers. What kind of wimps are you that can't shovel your own snow? You need a machine to do that for you. So as a hardy New Englander who would shovel the walk with a shovel or chopsticks or whatever I've got, I was going to shovel my walk. I was disgusted with these wimpy Midwesterners, and I vowed I will not buy a snowblower, which was great because we moved here in June. And so several months later, in November, I go away for a conference, and I'm speaking, ironically, in Southern California, where it's 72 degrees and sunny. The next morning after I arrive into Southern California, I get a phone call from my wife, and she asks me the question, why is it again we don't have a snowblower? And of course, I gave her the answer, because we're hardy New Englanders. We're not like these wimpy Midwesterners. We shovel our own snow, which is great, but all I've got is these pair of chopsticks, and I'm trying to shovel the snow outside. It's not happening. Well, it turns out that my neighbor, who grew up in Chicago, knows that there is a snowblower is needed in November, so he takes his snowblower and clears my sidewalk, clears my walkway, and saves my marriage. Now, what has happened? Am I going to come back from California and say, hey, here's $50, thanks for shoveling my snow? No, he has built not a fiscal capital with me, but he has built social capital with me. So the next time he needs a ride to the airport, I'm going to give it to him. Next time he needs a favor from me, I'm going to give it to him, because we have built social capital with one another. And social capital is a wonderful way to build community, to build neighborhoods, to build connections between neighbors. Now, here's an interesting question, though. Does social capital work in diverse environments? Does social capital in one cultural context communicate to social capital in another cultural context? This is a very important question in a very diverse environment that we live in right now. So I grew up as a Korean immigrant, thinking that whenever you have a family in your neighborhood, a Korean family, that buys a new home, you do one thing. You take a huge box of laundry detergent over as a housewarming present. Now, that's the context that I grew up in. You take a box of laundry detergent when somebody buys a new home. I actually assumed that that's what everybody in America did, that was a normal behavior to take a big box of laundry detergent whenever somebody buys a new home. So I'm a pastor in the Boston area, and a member of my church buys a new home, and so what do? I'm so happy and delighted to take a huge box of laundry detergent over to their home. And I thought I was building social capital. But I thought their clothes stunk or their clothes were dirty. And so the social capital didn't translate from my community to another community. So how then do we build the bonds, the connections, the relationships across the cultures? And this is the paradigm shift. A system of understanding the world through what we call brokerage. And in brokerage, there is a high value for diversity. There is a high value for difference, because brokerage means that you are interacting with people that are different from you, and you are gaining value in that interaction. The way this study was conducted was through something called cluster analysis. And what they did was a sociological study where they went into the workplace. This was actually a Fortune 500 company, and they started plotting out the relationships within that workplace environment. So they asked the questions like, well, who do you have most of your meetings with? Who do you take your coffee breaks with? Who do you have lunch with? Who do you invite to your home on weekends for barbecues? And they start plotting these out, these relational charts, into clusters, and found that a group of people were in the blue cluster, and another were in the light blue cluster, and another were in the red cluster. Now, many companies or many institutions will say the best leaders come from the middle of that cluster. That kind of makes sense, right? Because the person in the middle of that cluster is probably what? The center of social activity in that community. He's the person that always hosts the parties. He's the person that everybody talks to and if everybody wants to have lunch with. So the center of the cluster is usually the way we develop relationships and also the way we develop leadership. We look for the leaders who are at the center of the cluster. But the study found that the best and most innovative leaders were not at the center of the cluster. They were actually on the edges of the clusters. The most innovative, thoughtful leaders were on the edges of the cluster because they were moving between clusters. They were not staying in one cluster. They were not staying in one location. They would have breakfast with the sales crew, and then they would have lunch with the engineers, and then they would have the executives over for a barbecue, and then they would have coffee breaks with somebody else. And they were moving between all these different clusters, and they were brokering ideas between the clusters. and they were considered to be the innovative leaders because they were brokering ideas and relationships between the different groups. I'll give you a quick example of this. Like I said, I grew up in a Korean immigrant community. I was part of a Korean American church youth group. And in that isomorphic culture, we developed patterns of behavior that was pretty much common and kind of pretty much set within that culture. We had the same songs that we sang at every event. We had the same type of activities, the same games, the same speakers. Everything you name, we knew exactly what we were doing because we did the same things over and over and over and over again. Isomorphic culture. What happened, though, is that after I left to go to college, I spent a year in college in New York City. I left home in Maryland to go to New York City. And after a year in college, I come back the next year, and they're planning summer activities for the youth group. And who's the smartest guy in the room? Why? Because I have all these great new ideas. I have all these new ideas that I'm bringing to this group that have been doing the same things over and over again. Why? Because in my freshman year in college, I went to my first African American church. I went to a new campus ministry. I went to all these different experiences, and I began to collect ideas and relationships, and I began to bring those to my home community. I was brokering these relationships from one community to my home community, and I became the smartest guy in that room. That's innovative leadership. Not isolating yourself from others, but interacting with other communities, learning from other communities, gathering information, gathering resources, gathering relationships, and bringing that back and intersecting these communities. That's what makes for innovative leadership. So if you want to be an innovative leader in a very complex and diverse environment, then maybe eat at a restaurant that has a different type of cuisine than you're used to. Maybe learn a new language that's different from the one you're used to. Maybe develop relationships cross-culturally. Have a mentor that is of a different race and ethnicity from you. Maybe you are nicer to that immigrant family down the street, invite them over for dinner, or go to their house for dinner. Maybe you develop a relationship with that refugee family that just moved in and develop that connection because there might be something that they teach you that you can take somewhere else. And maybe if we do these things, we'll become better people, more thoughtful, innovative people. Maybe if we do these things, we'll build better communities and have more bonded and connected communities. Maybe if we do these things, we might even become a great nation. Or we can build that dome, but we'll get Canada to pay for it.